A red Nissan screeches into the emergency room entrance. The driver's side door flies open. A woman stumbles out, blood on her left arm. She's screaming, not crying, screaming. She's yelling for help, saying someone shot her kids and that somebody needs to help them immediately. Hospital staff rush to the car. What they find in the back seat will haunt them for the rest of their lives. 3 children, all shot at close range. 7-year-old Cheryl Lynn, motionless, blood pooling beneath her, already dead. 8-year-old Christy Ann, gunshot wound to the chest, stroke setting in, barely clinging to life. 3-year-old Danny, shot in the back, spine shattered, blood everywhere. The mother stands by the car, surprisingly calm now. Her name is Diane Downs. She's 27 years old, a mail carrier from Cottage Grove. She tells the hospital staff what happened. She explains she was driving home from a friend's house, taking a scenic route. All 3 kids were asleep in the back seat. Then she saw a man standing in the road, flagging her down. She stopped. He had bushy hair, she tells them. He demanded her car keys. She refused. They fought. He shot her in the arm. Then he opened the car door and shot all 3 of her children. She says she pretended to throw her keys into the bushes. While he looked for them, she jumped in the car and drove to the hospital as fast as she could. That's her story. Dr. Stephen Wilhite is the emergency room physician who treats Christy. He takes one look at the 8-year-old girl and thinks she's already dead, but he tries anyway. And somehow, against every medical odd, he stabilizes her. She's alive. Critical, but alive. When Dr. Wilhite goes to update Diane on her daughter's condition, he expects to see a devastated mother, a woman desperate to know if her daughter will survive. A woman crying, praying, begging for good news. Instead, Diane looks at him with no emotion, not one tear on her face. She asks him casually how Christy is doing. Not whether she's alive, not pleading to know if she'll be okay, just a casual inquiry about her condition, like asking about a stranger. Then Diane says something that makes Dr. Wilhite's blood run cold. She comments that the situation has really ruined her vacation. Dr. Wilhite stares at her. Her daughter is dying, her other daughter is dead, her son is paralyzed, and she's concerned about her vacation? Then Diane adds that this has really ruined her new car. Dr. Wilhite realizes in that moment he's dealing with someone who isn't capable of normal human emotion. Later, he would tell investigators that Diane showed not one tear and not one emotional reaction. Here's what makes absolutely no sense about this case. Diane Downs' story should be airtight. She's the victim here, right? A mother whose children were shot by a stranger. She was shot too. She drove them to the hospital. She's cooperating with the police. She's answering every question. But nothing about her story adds up. The crime scene is on a rural road in the middle of nowhere. Why would a carjacker target a station wagon with 3 sleeping kids instead of waiting for a better target? Diane claims she was shot in her left forearm during a struggle, but she's right-handed. If someone is facing you and shooting, and you put up your hands to defend yourself, your dominant hand goes up first. Why is the non-dominant arm injured? She says she drove to the hospital at high speed to save her children, but witnesses saw her car moving at roughly 5 to 7 miles per hour, slower than walking speed. One driver said they had to pass her because she was going so slowly. She says the attacker shot her first, then shot the children, but there's no blood spatter on the driver's side door, no gunpowder residue. The forensics don't match her story at all. And then there's her behavior. Dr. Wilhite isn't the only one who notices. Nurses notice, police notice. When Diane visits Christy in the recovery room, Christy's heart rate spikes. Terror shows on the 8-year-old's face when her mother walks in. It's like Christy is afraid of her own mother. Because she is. Because Diane Downs didn't drive her children to the hospital to save them. She drove them there to finish what she started. And the reason why will be even more disturbing than the crime itself. Christy Ann Downs was 8 years old in May 1983. She was the oldest of Diane's 3 children, responsible, protective of her younger siblings. The kind of big sister who looked out for Cheryl and Danny even when their mother didn't. Cheryl Lynn Downs was 7 years old. She was the middle child. According to people who knew the family, Cheryl bore the brunt of Diane's emotional abuse. She was the one Diane blamed for things. The one Diane rejected most often? Diane's ex-husband, Steve Downs, would later tell investigators something devastating about Cheryl. He said one day he caught Cheryl jumping on her bed. He told her it wasn't allowed and made her sit down to think about what she'd done. While sitting there calmly, Cheryl looked up at him and asked if there was a gun in the house. Steve said no and asked why she wanted to know. Cheryl told him she wanted to kill herself because her mom said she was bad. That's who Cheryl was, a 7-year-old who'd been told so many times she was worthless that she wanted to die. Stephen Daniel Downs, called Danny, was 3 years old. He was the youngest, still in that stage where everything is new and the world should feel safe. But Danny wasn't Steve Downs' biological son. He was the result of an affair Diane had during her marriage. Steve knew this, so did Diane. And Diane resented Danny for being the reason her marriage fell apart. All 3 children lived with their mother after the divorce in 1980. Steve had wanted custody, but Diane fought for it, not because she loved her children. According to everyone who knew her, Diane saw her children as possessions, extensions of herself, objects that existed to serve her needs. When the kids were good and made her look like a good mother, she tolerated them. When they demanded attention or had needs of their own, she rejected them, especially Danny. Steve Downs described Diane's parenting by explaining that she forbade everything to her children, and whenever Danny demanded attention, she rejected him. The children lived in an environment where their mother's mood determined everything, where love was conditional, where they existed to make Diane look good, not to be cared for. But despite all of this, they were just kids. Christy tried to be good. Cheryl internalized her mother's cruelty. Danny was too young to understand why his mother treated him differently than his sisters. They deserved a childhood. They deserved safety. They deserved a mother who protected them. Instead, they had Diane Downs. May 19th, 1983 started as a normal day. Those 3 children got into their mother's car thinking they were going home. Christy was 8, Cheryl was 7, Danny was 3. They trusted their mother because that's what children do. They don't have a choice. What happened next would kill one of them, disable the other 2 for life, and expose one of the most disturbing motives for filicide in American criminal history. Because Diane Downs didn't shoot her children in a moment of rage. She didn't snap. She didn't have a psychotic break. She made a calculated decision. She planned it. She drove them to a remote location specifically chosen for what she was about to do. And her reason was simple. There was a man she wanted, and he'd made it very clear he didn't want to be a father. So Diane decided her children had to go. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1995 in Phoenix, Arizona. She grew up in what appeared to be a normal family. She graduated from Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, where she met a boy named Steve Downs. After graduation, Diane enrolled at Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in Orange, California. She lasted 1 year. The college expelled her for what they termed promiscuous behavior. On November 13, 1973, Diane married Steve Downs after running away from home. She was 18 years old. Over the next 6 years, she had 3 children: Christy in 1975, Cheryl in 1976, and Danny in 1979. But Danny wasn't Steve's child. Diane had an affair. When Steve found out, the marriage effectively ended. They divorced in 1980. Even after the divorce, people who knew Diane recognized something was off about her. She didn't parent like other mothers. She didn't show affection. She didn't prioritize her children's needs. She saw them as accessories, as things that reflected on her, not as human beings with their own feelings and needs. By 1982, Diane was working as a mail carrier for the United States Postal Service in Cottage Grove, Oregon. That's where she met Robert Knickerbocker. He was a co-worker. He was married. And Diane became completely obsessed with him. Robert Knickerbocker was separated from his wife when he and Diane started their affair. For a while, he told Diane what she wanted to hear, that he'd leave his wife, that they'd be together, that everything would work out. But in early 1983, Robert reconciled with his wife, and he told Diane something that would seal her children's fate. He explained that he wasn't going to leave his wife for her, and that he didn't want to be a father to her children, or to any children for that matter. That should have been the end of it. A failed affair, a rejected woman moving on with her life. But Diane Downs wasn't wired like other people. She had been diagnosed with narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. Someone who lacks empathy. Someone who sees other people, including her own children, as objects that exist only in relation to her needs. When Robert ended the relationship, Diane didn't accept it. She became obsessed. She wrote him letters every single day. He returned them unopened. She showed up at his workplace, at his home. She stalked him. Robert Knickerbocker later reported to police that Diane seemed willing to kill his wife if it meant she could have him to herself. He told investigators he was genuinely afraid of her. He was relieved when she moved to Oregon because it meant she was finally out of his life. But Diane wasn't done. Even after moving to Oregon, she kept writing letters, kept trying to contact him, kept believing that somehow, if she could just make him see how much she loved him, he'd change his mind. And then she realized the problem. It wasn't that Robert didn't love her, it was that he didn't want children. He'd said it explicitly. He didn't want to be a father. So Diane came to a conclusion that only a sociopath could reach. If the children were gone, Robert would want her. She didn't consider therapy, didn't consider moving on, didn't consider that maybe this man simply didn't want to be with her. She decided to kill her children because in Diane Downs' mind, her children weren't people. They were obstacles. And obstacles could be removed. May 19th, 1983 started as a normal day. Diane Downs worked her postal route. Her 3 children went about their day. Christy, Cheryl, and Danny had no idea what their mother had been planning. That evening, Diane told the kids they were going to visit a friend. They piled into her red Nissan. Christy, 8 years old, sat in the front passenger seat. Cheryl, 7, and Danny, 3, sat in the back. Diane drove, not toward a friend's house, toward a remote, rural road called Old Mohawk Road near Springfield, Oregon. It was the kind of road where you wouldn't expect to see another car for hours. Isolated, dark, perfect for what she was about to do. According to what Christy would later testify in court, Diane pulled the car over to the side of the road. The kids were confused. This wasn't anyone's house. There was nothing out here. Just trees and darkness. Diane got out of the car. She walked to the trunk. The kids heard it open, heard her moving something around back there. Then, Diane walked back to the car. But she didn't get back in the driver's seat. She walked to the passenger side, to where Christy was sitting. Christy looked up at her mother. Diane was holding something. A gun. A .22 caliber handgun. Before Christy could process what was happening, Diane raised the gun and fired. The bullet hit Christy in the chest. The 8-year-old girl felt an explosion of pain. Her body went into shock. She couldn't understand what was happening. Her mother, her own mother, had just shot her. Diane didn't stop. She turned the gun toward the back seat. Cheryl and Danny were screaming, terrified. Diane fired again. The bullet hit Cheryl. 7-year-old Cheryl Lynn Downs, the little girl who'd asked her stepfather if there was a gun in the house because she wanted to kill herself. The child who'd been told over and over by her own mother that she was bad. She died almost instantly. Diane fired again. The bullet hit 3-year-old Danny in the back. It severed his spine. He would never walk again. Christy was still conscious, bleeding, dying. She could see her sister Cheryl slumped in the back seat, not moving. Could hear Danny crying. Could see her mother standing there with the gun. Then Diane did something that showed just how calculated this was. She shot herself. In the left forearm, a superficial wound. Painful but not life-threatening. Just enough to sell the story she was about to tell. She got back in the driver's seat, started the car, and began driving toward the hospital. But she didn't speed, didn't rush. Witnesses would later tell police they saw Diane's car moving at approximately 5 to 7 miles per hour, slower than walking speed. One driver said they had to pass her because she was going so unreasonably slow. Diane wasn't trying to save her children. She was giving them time to die. She'd shot Cheryl fatally. That was done, but Christy and Danny were still alive, still breathing, and Diane needed them to die before she got to the hospital, because dead children couldn't tell anyone what really happened. But Christy wouldn't die fast enough. Despite the gunshot wound to her chest, despite going into shock, despite a stroke beginning to set in from the trauma, 8-year-old Christy Downs held on to life. At 10:48 p.m., Diane pulled into the emergency room entrance at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital. She stumbled out of the car, blood on her arm, and started screaming for help. Hospital staff rushed to the vehicle. What they found was a scene of carnage. 3 children shot, blood everywhere, 2 still barely alive. Dr. Stephen Wilhite was called in. He took one look at Christy and thought she was already dead, but he tried anyway. And somehow, against every medical odd, he stabilized her. She was alive. Critical, but alive. When Dr. Wilhite went to update Diane on Christy's condition, he expected to see a devastated mother, a woman desperate to know if her daughter would survive. A woman crying, praying, begging for good news. Instead, Diane looked at him with no emotion, not one tear on her face. She asked him how Christy was doing. Not whether she was alive, not begging to know if she'd be okay, just a casual inquiry. Then Diane commented that this situation had really ruined her vacation. Dr. Wilhite stared at her. Her daughter was dying, her other daughter was dead, her son was paralyzed, and she was concerned about her vacation? Then Diane added that it had really ruined her new car. Dr. Wilhite realized in that moment he was dealing with someone who wasn't capable of normal human emotion. Over the following days, Diane's behavior continued to disturb hospital staff. When she visited Christy in the recovery room, nurses noticed something horrifying. Christy's heart rate would spike when Diane entered. The little girl's face would show terror, pure terror at seeing her own mother. Dr. Wilhite became so concerned about Diane's behavior around Christy that he did something extraordinary. He found a judge who issued an order making him and another doctor Christy's legal guardians. This allowed them to make medical decisions for Christy without Diane's interference. Because Diane had told Dr. Wilhite something unthinkable, she'd indicated that she believed Christy was brain dead and wanted him to pull the plug. Christy wasn't brain dead. She was fighting for her life. She was showing signs of recovery, but Diane wanted her daughter dead. Dr. Wilhite refused. He later explained that Diane was essentially asking him to let Christy die, and he told her firmly that Christy was doing well and that he wasn't going to pull the plug. He said he was very stern with her about it. While hospital staff tried to save Christy and Danny, police began investigating Diane's story, and immediately, nothing made sense. Diane claimed a bushy-haired stranger had flagged her down on this remote road, demanded her car keys, shot her when she refused, then shot all 3 children before she scared him off by pretending to throw her keys into the bushes. But crime scene investigators found problems immediately. There was no blood spatter on the driver's side door where Diane claimed she'd been shot, no gunpowder residue on the door or interior panels. The forensic evidence didn't match her story at all. Witnesses came forward saying they'd seen Diane's car driving unusually slowly toward the hospital, 5 to 7 miles per hour. That completely contradicted her claim that she'd driven at high speed to get help. And then police learned something that changed everything. When Diane arrived at the hospital, before checking on her children, before talking to doctors, before doing anything else, she made a phone call to Robert Knickerbocker, the married man in Arizona who'd broken up with her, the man who'd told her explicitly he didn't want children in his life. That's who Diane called first. Not family, not friends, not anyone who could support her through this tragedy. She called the man she'd shot her children for. Detective Doug Welch of the Lane County Sheriff's Office was assigned to the case. From the moment he heard Diane's story, he knew something was wrong. He later explained that there were a number of things which didn't make sense, even that first night. He questioned why someone would be sightseeing when it was pitch black out, and he noted that the kids were fatally or near fatally wounded while Diane, being right-handed, was shot in the left arm. Welch began digging into Diane's background. He learned about the affair with Robert Knickerbocker. He learned that Robert had explicitly told Diane he didn't want children. He learned that Diane had become obsessed with him after he ended the relationship. Detectives contacted Robert Knickerbocker in Arizona. He told them Diane had stalked him for months, that she'd written him letters every single day, that he'd returned them unopened, that he'd been genuinely afraid she might harm his wife to get to him. Robert also told investigators something crucial. Diane owned a .22 caliber handgun, the same caliber used to shoot the children. When police confronted Diane about the gun, she denied owning one, but Steve Downs, her ex-husband, confirmed it. Diane had bought a .22 caliber handgun in Arizona during their marriage. She'd brought it with her to Oregon. Police searched for the weapon but never found it. Diane had gotten rid of it. But while searching her home, investigators found unfired cartridges. When forensic experts examined them, they found something damning: extractor markings that matched the bullets recovered from the crime scene. The bullets that killed Cheryl and injured Christy and Danny came from Diane's gun. Detectives also discovered Diane's secret diaries, page after page of obsessive writing about Robert Knickerbocker, about how much she loved him, about how they were meant to be together, about how nothing would stop her from having him. And scattered throughout the diaries were complaints about her children, about how they were in the way, about how Robert would love her if only the kids weren't around. One passage was particularly chilling. Diane had written about her children as burdens, as obstacles to her happiness, as things preventing her from getting what she wanted. Investigators now understood the motive. Diane had shot her children to remove them from her life so she could pursue Robert Knickerbocker without the burden of being a mother. But they had a problem. Cheryl was dead and couldn't testify. Danny was 3 years old and couldn't clearly communicate what happened. And Christy had suffered a stroke from her injuries that left her with severe speech difficulties. The case against Diane was strong circumstantially, but prosecutors worried it might not be enough. They needed Christy to recover enough to tell them what happened that night. For months, Christy underwent intensive physical and mental therapy. The stroke had damaged her ability to speak. She had to relearn how to form words, how to communicate. It was a slow, painful process. Christy remembered everything from that night. She remembered her mother pulling over, getting something from the trunk, coming back with a gun, shooting her sister and brother. She remembered all of it, but she couldn't make the words come out. Her therapist worked with her every day. Speech therapy, physical therapy, trauma therapy. Slowly, Christy began to improve. Words came easier, sentences formed, memory became narrative. During this time, Christy was living with a foster family. She was safe, protected, away from Diane, who continued to visit the hospital and make everyone uncomfortable with her complete lack of appropriate emotion. 9 months after the shooting, on February 28, 1984, police finally had enough evidence to arrest Diane Downs. She was charged with 1 count of murder for Cheryl's death and 2 counts each of attempted murder and criminal assault for the shootings of Christy and Danny. The motive was clear. Diane shot her children to be free of them so she could continue pursuing Robert Knickerbocker, who'd made it explicitly clear he didn't want children in his life. Diane maintained her innocence. She stuck to her bushy-haired stranger story. She showed no remorse, no grief for Cheryl, no concern for Christy and Danny beyond superficial questions. As Diane sat in jail, awaiting trial, something shocking happened. She discovered she was pregnant, and according to investigators, it wasn't an accident. Diane had deliberately gotten pregnant by a newspaper reporter she'd had what was described as a brief fling with. She'd done it strategically. She believed that appearing in court as a pregnant mother would make her look sympathetic and would make the jury see her as maternal, caring, loving. It was calculated, manipulative, another example of Diane using people as objects to serve her needs. The trial was set for May 1984. Prosecutors had forensic evidence. They had Robert Knickerbocker's testimony about Diane's obsession. They had the secret diaries. They had witnesses who saw her driving slowly to the hospital. They had the fact that she'd called Robert before checking on her children. And they had one more thing, something that would prove more powerful than all the physical evidence combined. They had Christy. By May 1984, Christy Downs was 9 years old. She'd spent a year in therapy recovering from the stroke. Her speech was still affected. She spoke slowly, carefully, but she could speak. And she could tell the jury exactly what happened on Old Mohawk Road on May 19, 1983. The question was, would a 9-year-old girl with a speech disability be able to testify against her own mother? Would the jury believe her? And could Christy face the woman who'd shot her and her siblings and tell the truth without falling apart? The answer would determine whether Diane Downs spent the rest of her life in prison or walked free. The trial of Diane Downs began on May 10, 1984. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country descended on Eugene, Oregon to cover the case. A mother accused of murdering her own children was sensational enough, but the circumstances made it even more shocking. When Diane walked into the courtroom on the first day of trial, jaws dropped. She was nearly 8 months pregnant, visibly, unmistakably pregnant. The jury saw a pregnant woman and had to reconcile that image with the accusation that she'd murdered one child and tried to murder 2 others. It was exactly the cognitive dissonance Diane had been hoping for. Prosecutor Fred Hughey knew he had a problem. Diane looked sympathetic, maternal. How could someone who was about to give birth be capable of killing her own children? The prosecution called Dr. Stephen Wilhite to the stand. He testified about Diane's bizarre reaction when he told her Christy survived, about her comments about her vacation and her car, about how she'd shown no tears, no appropriate grief. He testified about the moment Diane asked him to pull the plug on Christy when Christy wasn't brain dead at all, about how he'd been so disturbed by Diane's behavior that he'd gotten a court order to become Christy's guardian just to protect her from her own mother. The prosecution called Robert Knickerbocker. He testified about the affair, about how he'd made it clear he didn't want children, about how Diane had become obsessed with him after he ended the relationship, about the letters, the stalking, his fear that she might harm his wife. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence: the lack of blood spatter on the driver's side door, the absence of gunpowder residue where Diane claimed she'd been shot, the cartridges found in her home with extractor markings matching the murder weapon. They called witnesses who'd seen Diane's car driving slowly toward the hospital, 5 to 7 miles per hour. One witness testified they'd had to pass Diane because she was going so slowly it was blocking traffic. The prosecution presented Diane's secret diaries. Read passages aloud where she'd written about her children as burdens, where she'd obsessed over Robert, where she'd complained that her kids were the only thing preventing her from being happy. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The prosecution called Christy Downs to the stand. Christy was 9 years old now. She walked to the witness stand slowly, carefully. She'd been working with prosecutors for months, preparing for this moment. But no amount of preparation could make it easy to testify against your own mother. Prosecutor Fred Hughey approached her gently. He asked Christy simple questions. Did she remember May 19th, 1983? Christy spoke slowly because of the speech difficulties caused by her stroke, but her words were clear. She remembered everything. Hughey asked the question that would decide Diane's fate. He asked Christy if she remembered who shot her. Christy Downs looked at the prosecutor. Then she looked at her mother sitting at the defense table. Diane stared back at her daughter with no expression, no emotion, nothing. Christy's answer came out clear and certain. My mom. The courtroom went silent. This 9-year-old girl, speaking with difficulty because of a stroke caused by the bullet her mother put in her, had just testified that her own mother shot her. Hughey continued. He asked Christy to describe what happened. Christy explained how her mom pulled the car over, how she walked to the trunk, how she came back with something, how she reached in through the window. Hughey asked what happened next. Christy said her mother shot her, and then shot Cheryl, and then shot Danny. The jury watched this small girl with a speech disability tell them in simple, clear language that her mother had murdered her sister and tried to murder her and her brother. Diane's defense attorney tried to cross-examine Christy, but there was nothing to challenge. Christy wasn't lying. She wasn't confused. She was telling the truth exactly as she remembered it. Christy was unshakable. She knew what happened. She'd known from the moment she woke up in the hospital, and now she was telling a jury, despite her mother sitting 15 feet away staring at her. The defense also tried to argue that Diane's mental state should be considered, but the prosecution's psychiatrist had already testified about Diane's personality disorders, about her complete lack of empathy, about how she saw her children as objects. After 6 weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and jury instructions, the case went to the jury on June 17, 1984. They deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all charges: murder, attempted murder, criminal assault. When the verdict was read, Diane showed no emotion, no shock, no tears, no reaction at all. The jury had seen through her. The pregnant belly hadn't swayed them. Christie's testimony had been too powerful, the evidence too overwhelming. Diane Downs was convicted of killing one of her children and trying to kill the other two, all because a man she was obsessed with didn't want to be a father. On August 17, 1984, Diane Downs appeared before the judge for sentencing. By this point, she'd given birth to the child she'd been carrying during the trial, a baby girl she named Amy Elizabeth. The birth happened just weeks before sentencing, and within 10 days of Diane's sentencing hearing, the state of Oregon seized baby Amy. She was immediately placed for adoption. A couple named Chris and Jackie Babcock adopted her and renamed her Rebecca Babcock. Diane would never raise another child again. At the sentencing hearing, the judge made his intentions crystal clear. He sentenced Diane to life in prison plus 50 years. Technically, under Oregon law, she would be eligible for parole after 25 years. But the judge stated plainly that his intent was for Diane to remain in prison for the rest of her natural life. The judge had seen everything the jury saw. He'd watched Diane show no remorse throughout the entire trial. He'd heard Christie's testimony. He understood that Diane Downs was exactly what the psychiatrist said she was, a deviant sociopath, incapable of empathy, who saw her children as disposable objects. After sentencing, Diane was transferred to the Oregon Women's Correctional Center to begin serving her life sentence. She was 29 years old. She would be at least 54 before she could even apply for parole. Christy and Danny, meanwhile, were placed in foster care. They needed stability, safety, a home where they wouldn't be terrorized by the woman who'd tried to murder them. Fred Hugi, the prosecutor who'd convicted Diane, did something extraordinary. He and his wife Joanne decided to adopt both Christy and Danny in 1986. They gave the children a new last name, a new life, a real family. Christy continued therapy for her speech difficulties. She grew up in a loving home. She eventually had children of her own, including a daughter she named Cheryl in memory of her late sister. Danny remained paralyzed from the waist down. He would never walk again, but he also grew up in the Hugi household, safe and protected. Both children changed their names and live private lives today. They've avoided media attention. They've built lives away from the horror of what their biological mother did to them. For 3 years, it seemed like Diane would quietly serve her life sentence and eventually die in prison. But on July 11, 1987, something shocking happened. Diane escaped. She scaled a 12 to 15-foot chain-link fence surrounding the women's prison while guards weren't looking. She used clothing to protect herself from the barbed wire on top. And she jumped down to freedom on the other side. A 14-state manhunt began immediately. Police feared Diane might try to find Christy and Danny, the children who'd testified against her. The children she'd tried to murder once and might try to murder again. Fred Hugi, who lived only 66 miles from the prison where Diane had been incarcerated, was terrified. His adopted children were in danger. The woman who'd shot them once was now free and potentially looking for them. For 10 days, Diane Downs evaded law enforcement. Where was she hiding? Nobody knew. Then investigators got a break. They examined Diane's prison cell more carefully. On a notepad, they found indentations. Impressions from where Diane had been writing on a page above. When they used forensic techniques to reveal what she'd written, they found an address. Police raided the location. They found Diane hiding at a house where a man named Wayne Cipher lived with 2 friends. The house was only a few blocks from the prison. Diane was arrested on July 21, 1987, exactly 10 days after she'd escaped. She was immediately transferred out of Oregon. Fred Hugi had lobbied hard to have her moved to a facility far from his home, far from Christy and Danny. Diane was sent to the New Jersey Department of Corrections Clinton Correctional Facility for Women. She received an additional 5-year sentence for the escape. In 1994, she was transferred again, this time to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California, where she remains today. Over the decades since her conviction, Diane has been eligible for parole multiple times. She's appeared before the parole board in 2008, 2010, 2020, and most recently in 2025. Every single time, she's been denied. And every single time, she maintains her innocence. She still tells the story about the bushy-haired stranger. She still claims she didn't shoot her children. She still refuses to take any responsibility for what she did. In her 2025 parole hearing, at age 70, Diane appeared before the board and continued to insist she was innocent. She showed no remorse because, in her mind, she had nothing to be remorseful for. The parole board denied her again. They noted that after more than 40 years in prison, Diane Downs still shows no insight into her crimes, no empathy for her victims, and no genuine remorse. She will be eligible for parole again in the future, but given her continued denial and complete lack of accountability, it's unlikely she'll ever be released. Diane Downs will almost certainly die in prison. Rebecca Babcock, the daughter born during Diane's trial, grew up with her adoptive parents, knowing nothing about who her biological mother was. As she got older, she learned the truth. She appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show and ABC's 20 Over 20 to discuss her feelings about being Diane Downs' daughter. Rebecca has said she regrets reaching out to Diane in her younger years through letters. She calls her biological mother a monster and wants nothing to do with her. Christy and Danny continue to live private lives with their adoptive family. They've never spoken publicly about their mother or the night she shot them. They've moved on as much as anyone can move on from that kind of trauma. Diane Downs' case became one of the most notorious examples of filicide in American history. Cheryl Lynn Downs should be 49 years old right now. She should have graduated high school, gone to college maybe, had a career, fallen in love, had children of her own. She should have had a whole life ahead of her. Instead, she died at 7 years old in the backseat of her mother's car, killed because a man didn't want to date someone with kids. Christy Ann Downs survived, but she carries the scars forever. Physical scars from the bullet, neurological damage from the stroke, and the psychological trauma of knowing her own mother looked her in the eyes and pulled the trigger. Danny Downs will never walk again. He was 3 years old when his mother shot him in the back and severed his spine. He spent his entire life in a wheelchair because of a woman's obsession with a man who didn't want her. Diane Downs is 70 years old now. She's been in prison for over 40 years. She's never admitted what she did, never shown remorse, never acknowledged that her children were human beings who deserved to live. She still tells the story about the bushy-haired stranger. She still plays the victim. She still believes she's the one who was wronged. Because in Diane Downs' mind, her children were never really people at all. They were just obstacles to what she wanted. And she removed them. Thank you for watching. If you want more deep dives into cases examining the darkest aspects of human psychology and criminal behavior, please subscribe. These stories need to be told. I'll see you in the next one.